any slides I put together because Rebecca designed them. So we both put the content together, but she is certainly much better at designing these things. So we're going to talk about ways of building a more inclusive class community. And what we'll be focusing on is your first impressions, what we can do to help build a good to get us started a good community right from the very beginning of the class, building community within that class as the class is progressing, how we can make the class structure a little bit more transparent to students in terms of providing them with enough information so that they know what they need to do within the class, and then talk about some ways in which we can increase class participation and student engagement in classes. So, all of this requires a lot of work up front, that these things don't just happen. It does require some planning and effort on our parts and some cooperation from students. And things are a bit more challenging than they were a couple of years ago in terms of building that sort of community. Or at least many of us have experienced that to some extent, especially last semester. So in terms of starting, well, in terms of creating a good first impression and to start building a connection with students, one of the things that really helps is connecting them with students before the start of the semester, like even this week or this weekend, or even before your first class, sending a welcome email at the least to students and welcoming them to the class could be a good way of just starting to create that sort of connection and to create more of a sense of instructor presence and so forth, whether the course is meeting in person or asynchronously. That sort of thing can help to welcome students and make them feel a little bit more comfortable and a little less apprehensive about the class. You could also use a welcome video, and that's a really effective way of engaging with students. It creates a nice personal connection when they're sitting and listening to you. Tell them a little bit about the course, and even just telling them how much you're looking forward to working with them as part of the course. So sending at least an email or putting together a short video. It doesn't have to be very formal. In fact, an informal video where you just say hello, introduce yourself, tell them a little bit about what they're going to be doing in the class. It can help ease the initial transition to the course and raise student comfort. Other things you can do in terms of course design, I know we're getting close to that point where we do have to get all these things together, but there was a concept that was put together originally by Ken Bain, where he referred to a promising syllabus. Recently, he's changed the title of that to Invitational Syllabus. But the basic notion is many of our syllabi look as if they were written by a team of lawyers to deal with any possible thing that students might do wrong or that students have done wrong at some point in your class or that you've heard of possible problems. And that's worsened a little bit by all the requirements that our institutions and systems require that we put in syllabus that make them very formalistic and so forth. What Ken Bain suggests, and what many people have suggested, is we make that syllabus a bit more friendly, that we can put all that information there at the end as we're required to. And sometimes people will say, and this is the information my institution requires that I share with you. Or sometimes people will put it in an attachment or an addendum or link to it. But welcoming students, designing a syllabus that's not necessarily ugly, something that is well designed could help, but it doesn't have to be. But the tone of the syllabus can really make a big difference. What Ken Bain suggests is that you sell the course in the syllabus. You talk about what students are going to be able to do as a result of completing this course, that these are the new skills they'll be able to acquire. These are things they'll be able to do when they complete the course that they wouldn't have been able to do as effectively beforehand. So talk about the outcomes you want students to get from the class, and then you can talk about the requirements. Instead of saying, this is how you're going to be graded. These are the things you must do. You must do them by these deadlines, say, and in order to achieve these objectives, these are things that you'll be doing to help you reach those objectives. So talk about the requirements in the course, the learning activities, as things that are necessary to help students reach those objectives. And basically, the promising syllabus idea is saying, if you do all these things, this is what you'll be able to get out of this course by the end. And the invitational syllabus is the same concept, but it got repackaged, I think, because promising syllabus had been adopted by so many other people. He wanted to reframe it a little bit to get the claim back on this in his more recent book. Another important thing, and this is something that we've emphasized in lots of workshops, and certainly with the accessibility challenges out there, it should be an accessible document. You should have headers and so forth so it can be read by screen readers. But it's nice if the syllabus, again, has more of a newsletter or brochure or a similar feel. One thing you can often do, and I've been doing this more and more in not all of my classes. I haven't been doing this in my large class, but in my upper level classes or smaller classes, I've used the first class day to collaborate on part, have students collaborate on part or all the syllabus. In the capstone course, we pretty much construct nearly all of the syllabus on that first day, where we talk about the things that they have to do to achieve the learning objectives for the course. And then we talk about what learning activities we'll use to do that. Depending on the course structure, there may be more or less freedom to do that, but there may be some choices that you can give students in terms of what types of learning activities you'll use. You might use, for example, you might give students choices of whether they're going to be writing papers or creating podcasts or creating videos, or using a more general unessay approach where you give them other ways of achieving the same learning objectives. But that's something that you can discuss with the students. You could also perhaps even formulate some of the rubrics with the students in terms of, how they're going to be evaluated on the projects. Another thing you could do is, if you don't want to do that discussion in your first day of class, you could actually post the syllabus in Blackboard, or either in Blackboard or as a PDF or in Google Docs, and let students annotate it. If you use Hypothesis or Perusal, you can post it there, and then students can raise questions, they can make suggestions, and then you can address those the next time you meet. Or one of the things I've done in my online class sometimes is I've done that type of thing and then use a discussion forum to talk about things that we might want to reshape and so forth. You want to get this down fairly early, probably within the first couple of class meetings, and certainly by the first week. But giving students a bit of a say in what they'll be doing and how they're going to be evaluated gives them a little bit more buy-in. And, if they feel they have more of a say in what they're going to be doing and how they'll be doing it, or how they're going to be measured on, how they're going to be evaluated on doing it, that can really help. But the basic purpose of the syllabus is to establish ground rules and to give students a bit of comfort about what they're going to be doing, what's going to be expected of them, and what type of support you're going to be providing. You need all the required syllabus elements in there, but it can be framed in a way that's much more inviting and much less threatening than many syllabi seem to be. One other thing I should note, I suppose, is that there's also the possibility of using what's called a liquid syllabus, which is basically a syllabus that's generally posted online and revised as the course progresses. That's another approach which, again, makes the syllabus seem more of a living document. You probably don't want to build a syllabus week, as we've been seeing in some of the discussions in the Oz Professors Hangout. You want to use class time productively, but one way of doing it is helping students become part of that community and letting them know that they'll have a bit of a say in what's going to happen in their class. Important things, and this has been discussed in other workshops, but learning students' names is one of the most inclusive things you can do in a class. And there's a lot of ways you can do it. One way that many people have used is to have students record their name and share that with a whole class. A simple tool you can use for that is Flipgrid. Flipgrid is a free tool, which is now owned by Microsoft. You can embed that in your class and just ask students to record their names and then spend some time learning those names. Actually, Michael did a workshop on learning students' names earlier. You can practice it. I think Michael talked about doing it row by row and going through, each row of your class over time until you mastered those names. But learning how to pronounce their names would be helpful, and letting students share their pronouns, giving them the opportunity to do that or not. Because some students will prefer to do that. Others may not feel comfortable doing that, depending on what stage they're at and so forth, or what their current status is and how comfortable they are with sharing that publicly. But asking students for this and having them share this can be really, having them share their names, their pronunciation and pronouns is really helpful in building that sense and letting them know that you do want to know them as people. And calling students by name really creates a lot of focus. There was a psychological study that I heard about actually on a podcast by Bonnie Stachowiak, where students were in an environment where they were trying to listen to one audio feed while there was background audio. And what happened was they were trying to listen in on a specific conversation and they were quizzed on it. But what occurred is that in the experiment, in the treatment group, their name was mentioned in one of the conversations. And once their name was mentioned, they remembered far more of that specific conversation than the others, because it caused them to focus. It made it more personalized. When you hear your name, it brings your attention to focus, and students are much more likely to be engaged if they know that you know who they are. It's a really simple strategy, although not so simple if you have 100, 200, 300, or 400 students, or if you're like me and not very good at remembering names, or not as good as I used to be in any case. Having students introduce themselves to the class, that could be done on a discussion board, whether it's if it's in person, you could do the introductions right in class. If it's a larger class, you might still want to use a discussion board, but you could also have students use a tool like Flipgrid to do short audio or video introductions of themselves to the class. But at the very least, a discussion forum is a good way of doing that, where students can tell the other students a little bit about each other and about themselves. And what will happen is that will naturally tend to start making connections in the students, because someone will mention a hobby and someone else will respond and say, oh yeah, I do that too. It's nice to know that there's someone else who has this interest in the class. And that can help make connections, especially if you're going to be doing some sort of group projects later. A really good tactic, a simple tactic to help build more of a community in the class, is just to arrive a few minutes before class and talk to students as they come into the classroom, or stay a little bit late. Don't just rush out the door when the class ends. Some students will want to talk to you at the end of the class, so stick around until everyone is clearly ready to leave. What a lot of people do is engage in some type of transition activity at the start of class. Rebecca does a bit more of this than I've done, but some people will play music at the start of the class, especially if you're on Zoom, but also in the classroom. One thing I did for several years, and I cut back on it because it wasn't working quite as well, was there was a whole series of videos that people put together where they use clips from songs with some economic content. And I'd often start the class by playing a song or a portion of a song as students were walking into the large lecture hall, and then ask them what connection that had to that day's class. It became a little bit harder. For some reason, it didn't work as well and I dropped it, but it's something I may go back to, especially if I go back to teaching a large class in person again in the fall, which I'm hoping we get to do again. Rebecca had students do some drawing on the screen in her class, which was remote synchronous. Before you start any sort of a group project, giving some time for students to introduce themselves to each other, which is something I should have done in this session, but I think, does everyone know each other here? Maybe we should do a quick round of introductions. I'm sorry, just to set a good example of that. Gwen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Gwen Kay. I'm in the history department. I'm the director of the honors program, and I was off campus for 4 years, spending time in SUNY Assisted Administration representing the faculty senate. So it's good to be back and see people.
It's good to have you back. I often saw you at the Fact 2 meetings, but it's good to see you back on campus. Kristen?
Hi, I'm Kristen Haynes. I'm the Assistant Director of Rice Creek Field Station.
And Michael? Okay, Mike has introduced himself in chat. And there's babies in the background there. He is a visiting assistant professor in anthropology and director of the Native American Studies program. And having students do this when they meet in groups is really helpful before they start working. It breaks down barriers. One case that really stood out for me on this was I was working with a friend and an instructional designer from GCC and giving a presentation on open pedagogy projects at the Online Learning Consortium. We had a group of like 45, 50 people that we broke up into groups. They were working at tables, and we were asking them to work on a group activity. And they were all just sitting there quietly rather than actually talking in their groups. And what Judy did was she said, well, let's get you started, introduce yourself to each other and talk about what you might be interested in doing, what classes you teach and so forth. And all of a sudden the discussions just began. It broke the ice. Having just these little introductions can help get discussions started much more productively than if students are just suddenly forced to engage in activity without knowing the people they're going to be talking to. I generally have done this, but I hadn't thought about doing that in a workshop in the same way. And it was just remarkably effective in getting the discussions to flow. And then we couldn't get them to stop talking in the groups for the rest of the session, which was okay because we were doing a lot of group activities. One of the things that research tells us is that having structure in your classes is really important. That in particular, it's one of the most important things we can do to reduce the achievement gaps that we tend to see in classes, primarily between first gen and continuing generation students. Some of our students come from relatively wealthy background. They went to well-funded school districts. They've had lots of resources. They have parents, sometimes siblings and family friends and friends that have gone to college, and they have really clear expectations of what's going to be expected of them and what they need to do to be successful. First gen students don't have those same sort of connections and resources. And the more we can provide support and making clear exactly what students need to do to be successful in our classes, those gaps in performance and the gaps in success tend to reduce pretty significantly. And when it's done really well, they can be eliminated. So you want to make clear to students exactly what they need to do, what's expected in the assignment. Be really explicit and transparent about what the objectives are for the course, for the module or the units that you're working on in the class, for what you're doing that particular day if you're meeting synchronously, what exactly the activities are and why you're doing the activities so that they don't think it's just some sort of busy work. Make it clear how this is connected to what they're going to be doing. And similarly with the assignments. And a general principle is don't include assignments if they don't align with the objective. So when you're designing your course, make sure that everything you're doing in it is going to help students reach those goals. Not just because it's something that was done to you when you were a student, which is how many of us started teaching, that we basically covered the topics that were covered when we were discussing, when we were learning this material, or, don't just focus on things that we find really interesting. Think about how important the things we're doing are in terms of helping students meet the objectives that we want them to achieve. And sometimes trimming that back can be a really useful approach. In history, it's referred to as an uncoverage method, uncoverage approach, reducing the focus on coverage and focusing more on the achievement of the basic learning objectives, rather than trying to cover a wide variety of topics at a very shallow level, focusing more on helping students achieve the course goals. And there's been movements for that in pretty much all disciplines, but I think historians came up with the uncoverage term. And it also helps them uncover the essence of the discipline is another meaning of that term. Using rubrics can be helpful. Providing students with checklists of exactly what they need to do at each stage can be helpful. Providing examples of what mastery looks like can be really helpful. So, if you ask students to do a project, giving examples of what a good project looks like, which could be from past student work, it could be something that you create. But one of the things you want to do there is you still want to provide students with autonomy. One of the objections that many people use to providing examples is, well, I provided an example of what a good term paper looked like, and then everyone else wrote something almost identical to that the next time. So if you're going to provide examples of high quality work, provide a variety of examples, letting students know that they can meet that objective using a variety of approaches. So that can be helpful. Make clear what the deadlines are so students could put them in a schedule. And you may have to adjust them, but adjust them in a way that's not going to harm students. And also make sure that all the assessments are, again, clearly aligned with the course objectives. Okay. In some cases, those rubrics can be developed with the students. One thing that Ken Bain has mentioned doing, and he's used this approach quite a while, is, well, or he had used this approach for quite a while before his retirement, but you could provide students with an example of, say, an A quality paper and a C quality paper, which you might create, for example, and then ask them to assess what makes this paper, or to meet in small groups and discuss what makes one paper better than the other one. You know, what are the things in it that make it a higher quality work, and use that to have the students help shape the rubric for the course so that they know what to look for in their own work. And when they're seeing it in some other sample of writing, it's much easier to recognize high quality work or low quality work than it is when you create your own work. So that's a good practice that many people have been adopting in recent years. You know, this is something I think you've all heard in one form or another, but low stakes assessment is really helpful for students. You know, if the first time they're asked to, you're giving them an assessment on the work is an exam that's 25% of their grade, if they don't do well on it because they haven't quite understood what's expected of them, it's going to be much harder for them to recover. Give them opportunities to practice, to learn, to make mistakes with no cost before they take any higher stakes assessments. You know, I don't think in my class anything is worth more than any individual task or assignment is worth more than 5 or 6% of their grade. And even in most of those cases, they have opportunities to do things over again. Now, there are some big projects that account altogether for 40% of the grade in some of my classes, but they're scaffolded. So each stage of it is a pretty low stakes assignment, and then they can revise that before they move on to the next stage. Now, again, that's something that you have to be careful about so that we don't take on more work than we can manage. You know, one of the concerns about this approach is that if you're going to give students more feedback, it may require a lot more work on your part. And the extent to which we can do this without imposing more work on ourselves can be really helpful. But sometimes one of the things that has happened nationwide is that with the movement to remote teaching and with so many people attending workshops from teaching centers that are focused on low stakes assignments and retrieval practice and other things, a lot of instructors move to giving students lots of small assignments. And it has led to a feeling for students that the workload has increased. And it quite often has. Now, that work can be really productive, but making clear, being careful not to overburden students is important, but also making sure that students know how much time is likely to be expected would be useful. There's a couple workload calculators online that could be used at least to provide some estimates of how much time various tasks would take. And you can use those to put in your syllabus or in Blackboard or where, however you're sharing this information with students, how much time they might expect to spend reading this material or participating in discussion or working on this specific task, just so that they can have some guidance. Now, some of them will be able to do this much more quickly. Some of this will take longer, but at least if you have some rough estimate, it's likely that students will be less likely to underestimate. And you can say, you know, everyone takes a different amount of time to do these things. You can use these as guidance, but then adjust it based on your own experience as you go through the class. Because we all tend to underestimate the amount of time that pretty much any task we agree to do is going to take, which is one of the reasons why we get, you know, why we agree to take on so many things. Students tend to do the same thing, but they, just like us, tend to procrastinate. And, you know, the more you can give them guidance on how much time is expected, the less likely they are going to be to working at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning before getting something ready that's due the next morning at class time or something similar. So, you know, emphasize why you're doing this. It's not just busy work, it's to give them a chance to learn, to make mistakes and practice that, and so on. If you do have high stakes assignments like major projects in your class, scaffold it. Do it in a way so that it becomes manageable. We all tend to put off work. We all tend to procrastinate. But if you take a complex project, let's say they're working on a semester-long paper or something similar, you can break that up into stages. In my capstone course, for example, The first thing I ask students to do is well, I've used various iterations of this in various versions, but essentially the first thing I ask them to do is to select a topic, either individually or in small groups, and then just to write up a very general description of what they're doing, sort of a preliminary abstract. Then the next thing I'll ask them to do is to turn in a bibliography so they can find whether there's research that they can use, or if it's something where they're going to be doing empirical work, to find a data source with a list of variables they might be working with. Then the next step would be to have them do an annotated bibliography. Then the next step is to turn in a rough outline of the work. Then the next step would be to turn in a rough draft, and and so forth. And by doing that, it makes a more complex project much more manageable, and it helps you make sure that all students are staying on track with the project. So scaffolding the assignment, giving students guidance early in the process before it's too late to ask them to redo everything from the beginning, can be really, really helpful. And it makes it easier for us, and it makes it easier for students, and provide lots of opportunities for feedback. And to the extent to which we can leverage feedback from other students, the better off we are and the better off students are, because they get to observe what other people are doing, and they get to see what some examples of good quality writing and maybe some less high quality writing would be. But when people get feedback from their peers, when other students are making suggestions, they tend to take it much more seriously than if we just give them a grade at the end of the term, or even if we give them feedback on a draft. Hearing it from their peers, people they've taken other classes with, or they will be in the future, they tend to take that really, really seriously and encourage revision. Students are reluctant to do revision, but it's a useful process, and we all know the importance of that. I just got back a second stage revise and resubmit yesterday. So revisions can often go on longer than you hope they do. But, having metacognitive reflection can be helpful. Offer students a time and some space to process what they've learned. How does it connect with their past experience and prior knowledge? That increases knowledge, and it also helps motivate what they're doing in the class. That if they understand what they're learning now and how it might be, if they understand how what they're learning is going to be useful for them in future classes or in their future careers or in their future life in some way, it certainly creates more intrinsic motivation for them to engage with the class and to work on it. And if they're working in teams, Rebecca uses what she calls a stop, start, continue retrospective. Often people just call it a start, stop, continue, where they work in a group and they just share with each other what they think the group should start doing, what it should stop doing, and what it should continue. More generally, just give some time for group processing. If they're going to do some group work while they're in class, spend a little bit of time and have them talk about what's working, what's not working. And that reduces the complaints we get where we have to work individually with people to get groups functioning more effectively. Because if they all sit down and talk about what's working and what's not, it's more likely that students will, if some students are shirking, which will always happen in some of the groups, hearing from their peers that they're letting them down can help motivate them in ways that just letting the problem slide until it becomes too severe, can be a problem. So if periodically you let the teams just meet together, talk about any issues, resolve them, and so forth. And one of the things I also do is when I'm having a long-term group project is have each group put together a document summarizing the ground rules on how they're going to meet, where they're going to meet, how they're going to collaborate, and also how they're going to resolve any differences or disputes, and how they'll be able to identify or essentially make sure that all members participate, and so forth. So setting that up at the start and periodically revisiting that through the term can be really helpful in having more of the groups be functional. There's always going to be some groups that won't be as functional as you'd like, and some students are always going to be disappointed by some of their peers. But even when you just talk to the students who are disappointed and remind them that they're going to be working in groups for the rest of their lives in some form, at least when their careers, and these things are going to happen then too, and learning some good skills and working with colleagues is a really useful skill to have. And sometimes that helps a little bit, sometimes it doesn't, but in any case, it is something that they will have to do. Make sure all the digital resources you have are accessible. Also, provide the course content in multiple formats and provide diverse perspectives to provide an inclusive environment. By multiple formats, that means you might have some materials, which is text that they read. You might have some videos they watch. You might have some poems they read. You might basically allow them to acquire the content using a variety of modalities that while research is pretty clear that we don't have learning styles, we do know that multimodal instruction is more effective than just using a single mode of instruction. That if you watch videos, if you read, if you see things, you hear things, and you interact with text and so forth, you learn things much more deeply than if you only use one modality for interacting with the content. And providing multiple diverse perspectives will help students see examples of people who look like them who are working on these things. That it creates more of a sense of belonging if you know that you're not on the outside of some group looking into a discipline that doesn't contain people from your category, from your group, whether it's race, gender identity, or whatever. That providing multiple perspectives can help make all students feel like they belong in the discipline and in the community in some way. And also giving students options. This is part of the UDL approach. Providing students with multiple ways to demonstrate mastery can be helpful. That can require more work in our part. For example, you could require a paper. As I said before, it could be a podcast, it could be a video, or it could be something else entirely. But giving students the opportunity to use their tools and their skills to present what they've learned in a way that they're comfortable with can be really helpful. So it's also a bit more work, and it does require a bit more structure to set that up. But often we're really concerned with having students show that they've learned something, and there may be many different ways in which they're able to do that. And don't just lecture like I've been doing. Getting feedback from everyone throughout the course is useful. Polling is really helpful, and that's been covered in other workshops. But the nice thing about polling is you can get immediate feedback, either with names attached, if that's appropriate, if you're trying to test learning objective, whether students have mastered some concept, or anonymously, if you want feedback on how the class is going, what's working, what's not working, how students are doing, what concerns they have, or just the general views on a topic. Virtual whiteboards are useful. So, for example, one of the most common ones that people use is the Google. I had it set up yesterday for 2 sessions, which we didn't get to. Jamboard. Jamboards are a really useful tool. You can, if you're teaching something on Zoom where some students are synchronous and some are not, or if you're meeting entirely, where some students are remote and some people are in person, the Zoom whiteboard could be used. Or again, even in in-person meetings, using a virtual whiteboard can be a really effective tool where people can post their comments anonymously. So it gives them a nice way of sharing thoughts and reactions, and it's quite useful. On Zoom, there's what's called sometimes a waterfall chat, or 1, 2, 3, go, or chatterfall, or all terms that people have used, where if you are meeting with a group of people in Zoom, you could ask people to answer a question, but don't press return or enter until you tell them to. And so that's why it's sometimes called 1, 2, 3, go, where you just say, I'll say 1, 2, 3, go. And when you hear the word go, press enter. But it gives everyone a chance to write something without having that sort of discussion board forum where once they see what other people have written, it may influence their own responses. This way you get to see really quick responses from everyone in the group. Again, if you're meeting on Zoom. But again, if they're connecting on, if they have computers in the classroom, you could use it then too. But polling is probably a bit easier if everyone is in the physical space. Get feedback from students using polls. Exit tickets are kind of nice at the end of a class session, where you ask students what they still are confused about, what they've learned, what they'd like to learn more about, or something similar. And often there's 2 or 3 questions on a typical exit ticket, also sometimes referred to as a muddiest point survey. So you can ask whatever is appropriate, but it's a good way of getting some quick feedback from students about what they've learned. That can be done in smaller classes just by having students write it on a piece of paper, but it could also be used with polling software. Or if you don't use polling software, you could always make up a simple Google form and post a QR code in the class. I did that in my large classes when the only clickers we had were multiple choice clickers, when they were the physical ones. Now I'm more likely to use polling software, but again, a Zoom QR code with a Google form can work really effectively if you want to get this feedback. In fact, in my large class, one semester, I did it every single class day, asking students what they had questions about, what they were confused by, and what they now understand better than they did before that class meeting. Surveys can be useful too. We can do them in our learning management system, whatever that happens to be. Right now, Blackboard, soon it'll be Desire to Learn, and so on. In terms of discussion options, one problem in a physical class is that discussions are not always very inclusive, because typically if you have a whole class discussion, you're only hearing from one student at a time. So one thing you can always do is have a back channel in your class. If you're meeting on Zoom, you could let people use a chat to ask questions, to share thoughts, to react, and so on, where they can respond to each other. There's also back channel apps you can use. Some people have used Twitter for this, where there's a class code or a class hashtag that you use, and there's several back channel apps. But some people have used Slack for that, where if you're meeting synchronously, you could have a back channel where people are discussing it. I know a lot of faculty do this at conferences, for example, where there'll be a back channel where people will be discussing the presentation as it's taking place, raising questions, other people will respond to that. And that can happen in a class too, often productively. My experience is it doesn't work quite as productively with first semester freshmen as it does with sophomores, juniors, and seniors, but it can be really useful at times. But the nice thing about a text-based chat is that everyone has an equal opportunity for participation in it. That, the people who are not as comfortable with raising their hand or just yelling something out in class, when they're typing something in text, have the ability to use the delete key and rephrase it before they click that enter key. And that makes people often feel much more more comfortable in discussion. Discussion boards can also be helpful to continue a discussion outside of class. But if you're going to do discussions in class, using small group discussions is also a really effective way of having more people engaged. So breaking up the class into groups for a discussion, it could be as simple as a think, pair, share, where everyone gets a chance to discuss it with one other person, or it could be small groups that then will report out to the larger group later. So, you could build it up where you have to think, pair, share, then you break it up and have two groups combine and talk about the concept, and then move it to larger and larger groups until you get a consensus, or at least you get to share all the reactions across the whole group. And random cold calling is another way of soliciting discussion participation that can be intimidating for students who may not always feel that comfortable with it. I saw a post, I think it was yesterday, in the pandemic pedagogy group, where there was a student who had some trauma issues in the past, and that had been relayed to the instructor. And what the instructor asked them to do is to bring a pink sticky note and put it on the front of their desk if they did not feel comfortable participating that day, and then move it out of the way when they not have it visible when they were comfortable participating. That's something that would have to be negotiated with the individual student, but cold calling can be intimidating. If it's done regularly, frequently, and with everyone, some people will use random name generating apps where it will randomly pick a name of someone from the class. That could be a good way of keeping students engaged, and they will become comfortable with it as they realize that they're not being singled out, everyone's getting an opportunity, and recognizing that if they don't know the end, and letting them know that it's okay that they don't know the answer. But it does provide a little bit of incentive for students to come to class a little bit more prepared if they know there's a chance they're going to be called on to answer a question of some sort. Another thing you can do is, don't just pause if you're giving a presentation and say, any questions? Ask them for specific questions that they have. Say, I'm not looking for an answer here. I'd like to see what questions you have about this material. There's ways of asking questions that are more likely to encourage people to participate than just saying, does anyone have any questions or something like that? So any questions about that? Sorry. Okay, moving on. There's a lot of active learning activities. There's many lists of those online. We've done a lot of workshops on those in the past, but some of the most common active learning exercises are think, pair, share, Jigsaw activities, which have become much more commonly used in the last few years. Fishbowl techniques, we had a workshop on that, I think last week. Yeah, it was last week. A gallery walk is one I don't think as many people here have been doing. And it's probably easier to do in person than it is, in the remote or the mixed experience many of us have experienced over the last few years. Team-based learning activities, where you have a persistent group, typically of about 5 people or so, plus or minus 1, who work together through the whole semester. And then they take quizzes both individually and then as a group with those little scratch-off cards, which now no longer exists. The company that makes them has gone out of business, but they're working on getting a new provider of those. Project-based learning, where you assign students to work in groups on projects, which could be part of the term or the whole term, or even just group problem sets, where people work on problem sets as a group. That's used a lot in STEM disciplines as a common way of introducing active learning in biology, chemistry, and so forth, and physics classes, where students are given a series of structured assignments that help them learn the assignments by working through problems and resolving it through experiments and so on. But when you have group activities, provide students with explicit structure and roles so they know exactly what they're going to be doing in that activity. And, mix these up so that students aren't always doing the same thing every day to help break the routine, but not mix it up so much that it's a source of tension and stress. Okay, so that's what I have. So what other techniques do you guys have? Let me stop the sharing here. That's not what I wanted to do, to stop the sharing. I wanted to stop the sharing over here.
John, I have a question.
Sure.
What is Jigsaw and Gallery Walk?
Okay. A Jigsaw approach is where you break up a concept, where you want students to learn a concept. Let's say where you're looking at, I'm trying to think of a really good example of it. Let's say you were studying some concept which applied to different countries. And what you would do is you would break up the group into, let's say there were four countries you want students to analyze, to look at a specific application of some concept you were learning about in your class. You would first break up the students into, let's say, 4 groups, where one group studies country A, one country B, one country C, and one country D. And then what happens is they meet within that group. Let's say everyone studying country A, you'll give them some readings to work through, and they'll put together a presentation on country A. And then similarly, the group working on country B, C, and D. And then they'll try to come up with a common explanation. They'll explain it to each other. They'll polish that presentation, and then they'll meet with a second group, where each of the group now will consist of one person who's worked on country A, one that worked on country B, one on country C, and one on country D. And each of those people will present their portion of the concept to the rest of the group. So the expert on country A will provide a presentation on that country. The person who studied country B will provide a presentation on that, and so forth. And then they will all they'll work on trying to come up with a common theme among all of them. So essentially, with the Jigsaw approach, each person learns a part of the concept, and then they explain it to the others. And then what will typically happen is the instructor will ask someone different in the group who was not the expert on that to summarize what one of the other people presented about that country. So they might ask someone who had worked on country B to explain what they learned about the experience of country A. So it's a way basically of giving students a little bit less reading, but dividing up the task into smaller chunks and letting each student become an expert on it and having them do that peer instruction of the rest of their group. But you do have to provide some sort of accountability, which is basically seeing how well the other people in the group are able to explain it. And if you do that regularly, then what happens is that well, if you do that regularly, they'll all realize that they have to listen to the explanation of the other students. One concern with that in practice is that students tend to learn the material that they were presenting really well, but they tend not to learn quite as well what the other presenters were doing. But it is a way of allowing you to address a wider range of topics in class without students having to do quite as much reading themselves. So, that can be done pretty easily in some disciplines. It could be done in literature, for example. It could be done in history, perhaps, where you have a given concept that shows up in different countries where there's some readings that they could look at in those countries and then pull together to see how that example may have occurred. It could be, I don't know, I've always found it a bit harder to do that in economics because so much of what we do is built in a hierarchical manner in terms of learning some concepts and then modifying them and expanding them, where it would be hard to understand the last concept if you didn't already develop the earlier thing. So it tends not to be used as much in the STEM disciplines. It's used a lot in comparative studies and literature areas, I think, most often. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay. And the other thing you asked about was the gallery walk, right? Was it the gallery? Okay. The gallery walk involves breaking a class up into groups and essentially creating stations where in each station, people are explaining a particular concept and then having half of the class move from one position to another. So, I've done something similar to this in my econometrics class when they do group presentations. Essentially, I have a poster session where half the group will present posters on their work one day, and then the other half of the class, and often people in the department, would wander around and essentially stop it. It's sort of like a poster session where people will wander around from one station to another and see the presentations from each group. So a gallery walk essentially is where you have some students presenting on a topic where they'll spend maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes listening to visiting station A, then moving to station B. That's one variant of it. Another variant of it is you might have yourself and some TAs do certain learning activities where at station A, they do one type of task, and then they might do a reading and some discussion, or they might do some type of creative work, and then they'll move to station B. But essentially what it involves is smaller groups working on different tasks, moving from one task to another. If it's student presentations or student-led activities, you'd rotate it where some of the students would be presenting and others would be rotating around the groups. And then you flip that around in another period to give everyone an opportunity to both present and also to learn from their peers in a similar way. That's my understanding of it anyway. It's the closest I've done to that, I think, is the sort of poster presentations, which, by the way, has worked so much better than the PowerPoint slideshows I used to have students present, because at the end of the term, I used to allow 3 days for student presentations. They put together these slides. They'd all be sitting there nervously, waiting, dreading the time when they had to present, and not really paying that much attention to any of the other presentations. But when they were there for the whole class period, explaining their work to other people and other, and some of the faculty in the department who wandered through, and we even had a dean stop by to check in at one point. It worked really nicely. And it was so much more fun for them to be able to do that than the traditional class end of term presentations were. So does that make sense? Okay. Any other thoughts or any other ways that we can help build a more inclusive class environment?
this is not really a way, but it's kind of another question for people's opinion. So it's been a couple years since I've taught, but I remember being struck by some of the differences in my evaluations at the end of each semester. Like certain classes, I would get these evaluations saying that I was like coming across as like a little intimidating, and like some of the students.
I think, did you freeze? I think so.
Oh, am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, sorry about that.
The last I heard was I came across as a bit intimidating, and then it froze.
Okay.
That may be the source is the intimidation, that frozen stare.
She's intimidating us with this long pause.
Sorry, my spouse and I are both trying to. Like all I'm getting is this feedback at the end of the semester. And do people have, these were all like really great suggestions, John, but I'm wondering, especially for that particular piece about instructor coming across as intimidating or approachable, if people have any particular suggestions. Yeah.
There's a few things I can think of, and then maybe everyone can participate. One thing you can just do is one thing you can do is just try to be more approachable. Learning students' names really helps. Chatting with them informally, if you see them in a hallway or before or after class, can help. Sometimes telling some personal stories about struggles you had while you were learning, some experiences you have. Not that would undermine your credibility, but letting them know that, it is a struggle and that you went through very similar experiences. Giving them some information that will help them make connections to you can help. I know, sometimes just little personal stories that are somehow relevant. You don't want to reveal things that aren't appropriate to reveal, but letting students know you a bit more as a person can be really helpful in reducing that intimidation factor. And letting them know that your job is to really help students be successful can be really helpful as well, because we're in this role where we have to evaluate them and assign grades at the end, and that by itself can be intimidating. Any other suggestion? Oh, one other thing I would suggest is don't wait for the feedback at the end. Do some type of an activity to get feedback at least once a semester. Some people will do it midterm, but you could even do it every couple of weeks or even every week, just saying what's working well for you in the class, what's not working so well. One of my predecessors in this role used to give a survey halfway through the term where he asked students what he could do to make the class more effective for students. And then he'd also give them a question of what students could do to make the class more effective for themselves. What could they do to improve their performance? And doing things like that does kind of show that you do want them to be successful and you want them to reflect on what they can do to be more successful, but you also would like to know what you can do to help them. And then when you get that results, you can go through it a bit and talk to them saying, this was a really common suggestion, and here's what I'm going to do to try to change this. Or quite often it will be, and I understand why you're saying this, but that's not going to be as helpful in achieving the goals that we want you to achieve. So I'm not going to be able to do quite what you're requesting, but here's why, and let them know that you're not just arbitrarily imposing conditions on them, but there's a reason for it, which is really something you think is going to be helpful for them. That type of thing I think can be really helpful. Any other suggestions? Gwen, Michael?
There was a study that just came out today, maybe I just saw it today in Inside Higher Ed or something, and it said that all the evaluations really have much more to do not with us or you intimidating them, Kristen, but grades. And so shockingly, there's a correlation between perceived easy grades and high student satisfaction, and people who are seen as hard graders tended to get worse evaluations. And I don't know what to do with that either, because I've tried the midway questions, and sometimes it's helpful, and sometimes it's just made me say, I know that you want to do X and I can't, and here's why. But at least they feel like they've been heard. Even if nothing changes, they have this perception that I'm paying attention.
Yeah. And I think that aspect of it is really important, that you're not just this authoritarian figure doing it, but there is a reason that, you know, you've heard them, you recognize their concerns, and you recognize why they feel that way. But there's a reason why you're doing things the way you are. And just that sort of discussion can be helpful. But yeah, and the grades you assign to students are the most important predictor of student evaluation. Gender plays a role in course evaluations as well. And there's so many studies of those things. Race plays a role in course evaluations as well. Academic discipline will play an evaluation. If you're teaching math, you're always going to get lower evaluations than if you're teaching art, for example, or, you know, some type of creative field. Well, not always, but most often, that there are some pretty persistent differences. And the gender ones are really dramatic, including the terms that are used. There was a really interesting study where an online class was used. Christina Mitchell was teaching it. Well, was the overall coordinator for this, but basically they faked, as part of an IRB approved research study, they faked the name of the people who were actually interacting with students, and they reversed the genders, and they found the name was the primary predictor of the term that was used, not the actual gender of the person, because all of the feedback going to students was coming from the central coordinator, but there were dramatic differences between sections depending on who the perceived instructor was, even though, you know, they were not the actual people doing the interactions. So yeah, so it is an issue, but I guess we're about out of time. Any other quick thoughts? Okay, well, I'm going to end the recording and the session, and then the next session will be coming right back with Zach. I'm afraid I'm going to have to end the session, though, to get the video rendering in the background. So if you're coming in for Zach's session, we'll be right back.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.